Please take your seat. Our program will now begin. Veuillez prendre place. La séance va maintenant commencer. Por favor, tomen asiento. Comenzaremos con nuestro programa ahora.
Good afternoon. Thank you all for attending. So, again, my name is Jeff Lejeune from Food Safety Officer at FAO. I want to just have a few introductory remarks before our keynote speaker speaks. A lot of this information that you'll be hearing today is kind of the genesis from a project at FAO where we're trying to build capacity in low and middle income countries for use of the risk analysis framework and the One Health approaches. And we're working in Vietnam, Mongolia, Tanzania, and Laos, PDR, with support from the Republic of Korea to achieve this project in building capacity. So, you see the title, and I guess we can comment on that a little bit later, but the idea is there's a science here about risk communication. So how many first-time delegates do we have here? There's a few. And you know, okay, so now you don't have to really raise your hand. I don't know when the last time the rest of you actually looked at the Codex procedural manual on how things happen or how they should happen. But I looked at that, and on the very first pages, you see that Codex is functioning using this framework of risk analysis. And the risk analysis framework, as you all are aware, includes risk assessment, risk management, and risk communication. And if you continue looking at this procedural manual, we want to find out, well, who is responsible for what? Okay, so you as the Codex Alimentarius Commission and its subsidiary bodies are responsible for the risk management, okay? On the other hand, sitting on that side of the room typically all week, WHO and FAO together in our expert panels provide the risk assessments to support your decision making, okay? So that's the two factors. They're fairly clearly defined. Now the third one, who's responsible for risk communication if we need to do all this? And the procedural manual is very clear and talking about the need for the subsidiary bodies, the electronic working groups and whatnot to dialogue with the risk assessors as we move forward, whether it's with GEMRA or JECFA or whatever. But when it talks about the responsibility for risk communication, it basically says everybody. And you kind of know that idea. If everybody's responsible, then sometimes it feels like nobody's responsible. But in fact, it is the responsibility of everybody, including the risk assessors, the risk managers, and all other interested parties, whether it's academia, consumers, civil society, and industry, okay, along with the competent authorities in our intergovernmental organizations. So, going back to the other point I want to make is that these principles should be based on science. That's the whole idea. You can't just make this stuff up, right? And I feel fairly comfortable over there in the risk assessor seat. And you guys are doing gangbusters on getting through your risk management. But when it comes to risk communication, I didn't want to stand up here and make this stuff up. So I'm trained as a veterinarian, a microbiologist, epidemiologist. How many microbiologists are in the room? You call yourself a microbiologist. Okay. How about food scientist? Okay. Any epidemiologist? Veterinarians? Lawyers? Oh, you can go. I don't know what else that we might have, President. And how many psychologists? Right? So if we want to understand and base our communication based on scientists, we need to make sure that we have engagement with scientists who are knowledgeable about the topic. Now, Dr. Hallman spent a year with us at FAO on a sabbatical leave. He is a distinguished university professor at Rutgers University here in the United States, in New Jersey. He has over 36 years, I don't know when I updated your CV last time, years in working on public perceptions of risk and risk communication, and really focused on food safety issues. These hot button items, and he can talk to you a little bit more about them, things that go back from food safety, disease outbreaks, GMOs. We worked more recently on some of the issues with cell-based foods, irradiation, you name it. He has tackled a lot of these issues. So with no further ado, I'd like to invite Dr. Bill Hallman to come and tell you the real stuff instead of have me make anything up. Thank you.
Great. So thanks very much, and thanks to all of you for coming and spending part of your lunch with us. So as Jeff said, my name is Dr. Bill Hallman. I'm a distinguished professor at Rutgers, the State University of New Jersey, and I work in the School of Environmental and Biological Sciences, where honestly there aren't a whole lot of psychologists either. So I spend most of my lunch hours speaking with my... The title of my talk is You Can't Just Make Stuff Up: Improving Food Safety Through the Science of Risk Communication. And I will tell you that this title was a little more scatological when I proposed it, but I had to tone it down slightly. So the core of my message today is that effective risk communication is essential for improving food safety. Jeff's made that point. I also want to emphasize that risk communication is a science. And it requires evidence-based strategies, not a reliance on generic advice, on assumptions, or personal intuitions, which is what we typically depend upon. Effective food safety risk communication also requires more than simply translating scientific information in ways that the public can better understand. Yeah, that's really important, and I do a lot of work on that too. But it's more than that. It's not simply translating technical information to consumers. I also want to emphasize that improving food safety often involves changing people's beliefs, attitudes, intentions, and behaviors, and that is generally beyond the scope of what most of us are trained to do in microbiology. And I want to emphasize, and I will emphasize, yeah, facts are important. We need to do a better job of communicating facts to the public, but they aren't necessarily persuasive on their own. So with that, let's jump into it. So first of all, there is a science of risk communication. The problem is that very few of us have had formal training in communicating either science or risk. How many of you had a class, an entire semester-long class in your training on risk communication? Nobody. How many of you have had an afternoon training? A few of you. I've done some of those. I've done 3-day courses on risk communication. And those are great, those are useful in giving you some important tips. The problem is that they're not enough. And in fact, because most of us have not had formal risk communication training, we tend to rely on our intuitions about how to communicate with the public. based on our friends and family. And the problem with that, of course, is that we overestimate what we think other people know and the values that they hold being quite similar to our own. And we think, oh, well, if I were to say it this way, I would understand it, so everybody else would understand it as well. And the problem is that that just does not hold. The key thing is intuitions, even if informed by experience, aren't always correct. There's a science to this. Whoop. Another issue is that, yeah, many of us have had an afternoon's risk communication training. Part of the problem with many of these trainings is that they basically give general advice. Most of the seminars, most of the guidebooks that are out there give general advice that's not directly actionable. So we hear things like, know your audience. Good advice. Well, how do you know your audience? How do you go about doing that in a way that is empirically based, so that if you were to ask the same question more than one time, you would get similar answers? Well, one of the ways that you can do this, that we train people to do in the science of science communication, is social media monitoring. So one of the things that we can do is look at what information people are passing on, commenting on, flagging, and that can provide early warnings about food safety problems, and there are companies that do this that anticipate that there's a foodborne illness outbreak based on people talking about a particular brand or a particular food. It can identify potential foodborne illness outbreaks. It can surface public concerns about specific foods, brands, vendors, and other issues. Most major food companies are doing this themselves to do what's called sentiment analysis, to see how consumers are interpreting the messages that are being put out there by the companies. Are they basically positive or negative or what? We can also use social media monitoring to identify misinformation that needs to be corrected before it goes viral. And we can engage with our audiences in real time. So something, misinformation is put out there, it gives us an opportunity to correct that misinformation before it can really go viral. And we can have conversations with people via social media. We also use market segmentation. So this is something that we borrow from marketing and selling products. And this is important because one of the things that we find is that general food safety messages often fail because they don't meet the needs of specific audiences. Not everybody is in the same starting point. So putting out a message doesn't necessarily connect with what people think they already know, with what they believe, what they value. We need to do a better job of segmenting our audiences and delivering targeted information in targeted channels to targeted audiences. Companies who do marketing are really good at this. We just need to borrow their techniques. Another issue is that much of the information that's out there to train people about how to do risk communication around food safety is based on case studies or the experience of particular experts. And case studies are important, but essentially they're most important to tell you what worked in the past. The issue is that few case studies are written about things that did not work, the things that we're not particularly proud of, the things that might land us in court, for example, because we didn't do a good job of risk communication. So we only get sort of the positive information, and we never really learn from the mistakes that happen, which means that we keep making the same mistakes over and over and over again, and we never write them down. So we don't have this body of knowledge that we pass on to one another. We also know that case studies are typically about what happened in the past. And we are in a rapidly changing world. I don't think I need to convince anybody of that. You know, so societal beliefs are rapidly changing. Values, assumptions, trust in government, trust in science, trust in you all are changing very, very rapidly. And I also don't need to convince you that the media landscape is also rapidly changing. So what worked 15 years ago with respect to communications may in fact not work right now given the social media landscape. There is a science of science communication, particularly of risk communication. Again, one of the issues is that the science of risk communication really came out in the 1970s, began in the 70s and 80s when I was in graduate school, and was really focused on environmental contamination, not food issues. So many of the principles that are out there are based on water contamination, air contamination, people's concerns about nuclear power. They're not specifically focused on food issues. And so we can use some of the principles that came out of environmental contamination, but they don't always particularly apply to food issues. However, there are pieces of peer-reviewed literature out there that are really focused on food safety risks. We need more of these. We need up-to-date, evidence-based, peer-reviewed studies of effective messaging about specific food safety risks to specific audiences, not general advice, not general case studies. We need peer-reviewed evidence on what works with respect to perceptions of risk and vulnerability, again associated with specific food safety risks. We need to do a better job of understanding how people think about these risks. What are their mental models? What are their cognitive models of how or why a specific food safety risk does or does not pose a particular risk to them and to their families? We need to do a better job of figuring out how to communicate uncertainty about specific food safety risks. And there is a literature out there, but we need more peer-reviewed evidence showing what does and does not work. And we need to do a much better job of doing empirical work on stakeholder engagement. Not every stakeholder is the same. So what works with business may in fact not work all that well with consumer organizations and so forth. Now, I started my career in risk perception focused on environmental contamination. My dissertation was focused working with a community that was facing water contamination from a hazardous waste dump. And so that's where I learned about risk communication. I've also done work on lead poisoning. I do work on climate change, lots of environmental contamination issues. And I think I was about 15 years into my career when I suddenly woke up one day, because I'd been doing work on food issues, that food is fundamentally different. Communicating about risks related to food are different than communicating about all of these other risks. Foods are different. Food risks are different. Why are they different? Well, for one reason, we figuratively and literally incorporate and internalize the risks that we perceive with particular food issues. That's really different than, for example, how we think about nuclear power. So food risks are different, and there is an anthropology and a sociology of food that we need to understand as well. Now, I will be the chef for Christmas dinner, and I will spend a lot of time working on the main dishes and the desserts. And my son, who I love dearly most of the time, is somebody who works out a lot and consumes a lot of protein shakes. And he knows that if he wants to upset me, all he needs to do is to say, after I spent 8 hours cooking Christmas dinner, is to say, you know, Dad, food is just fuel. No, food is not just fuel. Food is so much more than that. And think about the roles that food play in your own lives. You know, think about the cultural and religious meanings associated with food, the things that we eat in celebration, the things that we're not permitted to eat based on our religious practices. It carries emotional meaning. There's a reason that when we are meeting somebody and we go out on a first date, we will often go out for a cup of coffee or a dinner or a meal or something. It's important to creating and maintaining bonds with other people. The idea of being able to feed your child carries meaning beyond simply nutrition. It carries symbolic meaning. Certain kinds of foods indicate purity, indicate nurture, the ability to nurture. There are political meanings related with particular food issues. And of course, there is the signaling of identity that we do using particular food issues. Many of my students are entry-level vegans, and they are sure to tell me that. So they signal their identity that they are vegans. So food carries meaning beyond simple nutrition. So we need to be aware of this. So, which brings me to the point of we need to communicate more than just the risks associated with the foods. We need to understand more than just the perceptions of the risks, the hazards associated with foods. We need to understand these meanings. So we need to understand perceptions of food, not just the hazards that we're trying to communicate about the foods. What roles do the foods play in people's lives? And is that going to basically cancel out any of the risks that we're talking about? Jeff has already introduced this. I want to emphasize that risk communication is essential and integral to the entire risk analysis process. When I was originally taught risk analysis, I was taught that there are three pieces to this. First, you do the assessment, then you figure out based on the assessment and who's vulnerable, how you're going to manage the risk, and once you've decided how you're going to manage the risk, well, then you're going to talk to the public. You're going to translate the technical information to the great unwashed. That was the way it was taught to me by engineers. That, my friends, is a mistake. It does not come at the end of the process only. In fact, sometimes risk communication has to come at the beginning of the process. If you're going to do a risk assessment, how do you know what people are consuming? How do you know what they're doing that increase or decrease their vulnerability to a particular risk? When you need to understand who's effective. So how are you going to collect that information if you're not talking with people? You can't simply rely on the handbooks. Yeah, I know they're out there, but they're usually wrong. Sometimes it comes in the middle of the process. So when stakeholders weigh in on the practicality, for example, of prevention or mitigation measures. Okay, great. Risk managers, you've come up with this idea, but it's impractical for us as a manufacturer or a processor to really do that. We don't have what we need to do that. So you need to talk with us. We need to talk with you. And of course, the risk assessors and the risk managers also need to be talking with one another. That is, in fact, covered by the manuals, okay? What I really, really want you to take home is that risk communication is not simply translating complex food safety messages to the public or other stakeholders. It is involved in every step of the risk analysis process. And there is a science to this. Now, I've talked about risk communication, but in fact, that's the wrong name for what it is that we're typically doing. Often, we're not simply talking about risks, we have to talk about risks and benefits, right? So on the left-hand side, warning, risk, fish contaminated, do not eat. On the right-hand side, there are the benefits, eat more fish. Fish gives you brains. With brains, you can make money, and money can buy more fish. So there are both risks and benefits. This is from a fishmonger's shop. But it's not simply listing on the one side, here are the risks, and here are the benefits, and now that I've told you about the risks and benefits, you all make up your own minds. In fact, what people are often looking for is guidance. In part, we know from psychology that if you lead with risk, people will remember risk, and they will discount benefits. So if you simply list risks and benefits, then one of the things you can do is push people away from a beneficial food. So sometimes we have to emphasize particular benefits, but honestly, talking about the overall effects of eating certain foods can be particularly beneficial for folks in helping them make better choices, not simply a list of the risks and the benefits. So I also need to emphasize, and you probably all know this intuitively, that risk communication sometimes has unintended consequences. And this is the example I tell my students, I give to my students. Back in 2001, the FDA and EPA issued an advisory to American consumers about consuming fish. And so I'll just read just a little bit of this. Today, the Food and Drug Administration issued advice to pregnant women and others on the hazards of consuming commercially available fish that may be contaminated with mercury. And then it goes on, EPA is recommending that women who are pregnant or may become pregnant, nursing mothers and young children limit consumption of such fish to 1 meal per week, 6 ounces of cooked fish per adult, 2 ounces of cooked fish per child. So this was the advice that came out, focused on the risks of mercury. That was the press release. This is how it was covered by the media. FDA warns women not to eat fish, at least some fish. And I won't go to the trouble of trying to read the fine print here, but you can kind of see it. The way that this was translated by the media was, this is a huge problem. And so what was the effect of this? Again, we've got empirical evidence. The good news is that the warning reduced mercury intake from fish. The problem was that women ate less fish overall, not just those high in mercury, not just large predator fish, swordfish and those sorts of things. They ate less salmon, they ate less shrimp, they ate less fish overall, which meant that there was less of an intake of omega-3 and other essential fatty acids. And of course, because in the United States, as in most other places, mom decides what the family is going to eat. If mom is not eating fish, the entire family is not eating fish. And so there were drops in fish consumption overall, which is not great for children's developing brains. So we can have unintended consequences of even well-meaning messages. You know, one of the issues is that EPA, their mandate is to focus on risks, not necessarily on risks and benefits. We've learned from this, and the new advice from FDA is a bit more balanced. I've done some research on this. It's not fabulous. I'm a tenured professor, I can say that. Is there anybody at FDA in the room? My research suggests that this is quite confusing to many, many people. So we can do empirical work to do message testing to see what does and does not work. I also need to emphasize that the types of risk communication contexts differ with respect to various food issues. And some of you have probably seen this graph. The x-axis is public concern, the y-axis is public health impact. And so we've got 4 quadrants. So we've got high public health impact and a high level of public concern. You know, that's typical crisis communication. We have an outbreak or we have a recall. We need to get the word out. On the left to that, in the yellow, we've got high public health impact, but a low level of public concern. A good example of that is listeria and soft cheeses. It's a problem, but most people aren't really aware of it. On the lower left, we've got low level of public health impact and a low level of public concern. Food grade waxes, for example, not many people know very much about them. They're not really complaining about them, so that's a different issue. And one of the things that I've worked on a lot are GMOs and food additives and public perceptions of that. Here there is a low level of public health impact, but a high level of public concern. So different contexts. The problem is you never know when an issue in one of these boxes is going to move to a different box. So what we think is a low level of public concern and a low level of public health impact, based on a new study, may in fact have a much higher level of public health impact. And now we're in the upper left rather than the lower left. So what we need to do as risk communicators related to food safety differs depending on which issue, which box your issue is in. So for GMOs and food additives, the idea here is to help put risk into context and address concerns. For a low level of public health impact and a low level of public concern, what you want to do is put the information out there for people who are looking for it. So you are essentially becoming the authoritative expert on this so that misinformation doesn't slip in. Upper left, high level of public health impact, low level of public concern. You need to actively persuade people to act. Right? There's a problem and people aren't taking appropriate action. It's more than simply providing the facts. It's actually encouraging them, persuading them to act. And then, of course, in the upper right-hand side, we need to rapidly and widely communicate warnings and information, keep that up to date, addressing misinformation. So not all risk communication issues require the same or will benefit from the same kind of work. Now, it won't surprise you as a psychologist for me to tell you that to effectively communicate about risk, you have to understand how people perceive it. And this is how I spend a lot of my time, understanding people's starting points. Why is perception important? Because it doesn't matter what the objective science says about the risk. What matters is how people perceive it. Their actions, their beliefs are based on their perceptions, not simply on what you say the science is. So we need to understand where people are. Now, we know that there are two components to risk perception. There is a cognitive component, that is what people think about it. Again, they're mental models of how or why this hazard poses a threat, and their understanding of the likelihood that they would be affected and the consequences if they were affected or someone they love or are responsible for are affected. Their understanding of the social contexts of the hazard, who's in control, who's benefiting from this. So their understanding of the risk itself. And then the second piece of this is affect or emotions, feelings. So things like dread or fear or worry or frustration and so forth. So these are our emotional reactions to the particular risk. Now the question I have for you is, which comes first, thinking or feeling? And I need to tell you that many of my colleagues in behavioral economics, which is, by the way, just psychology, so people in behavioral economics, some of my colleagues in psychology and marketing are convinced that thinking comes first. First we think and then we feel. And I like to joke that those colleagues have clearly never been in love. Because well, you get the idea. So often what happens is emotions come first. We make a quick assessment of the risk and we go with our guts. Oh, this is scary. Oh, this makes me worried for my kid. And then we look for reasons for why we feel the way we do, to justify after the fact the decision that we've made, or the belief that we've shared, or the misinformation that we have shared. Feelings matter. Now, I want you to take a close look at the way we scientists, and I am a scientist. I'm a fellow of the AAAS, the American Association for the Advancement of Science. I'm very proud of that. It means I'm a real scientist based on my colleagues in biology. If we look at the way we scientists communicate about important food issues, we're all about cognition. I've done a lot of work on GMOs since the early 1990s. This is the communication around GMOs. It's about cognition. So this is how we do it. And here's the pathway from standard hybridization or selective breeding. And if you just understood the facts, you would understand that GMOs are just the latest thing in this. This is the way activists communicate about GMO risks. There is no cognition here. This is purely affect. Similarly, food safety messages from us as experts are all about cognition. Do you really need instructions on how to wash your hands? I'm just asking for a friend, right? But we post these things suggesting that we're helping people understand how to do this better. And we do it in multiple languages, right? This is about cognition. This is about telling people the facts. And again, this is extremely important. I'm not at all saying we shouldn't do this. All I'm saying is that this is not enough. Activists' messages on food safety issues often rely on affect. Mini monsters, depicting pathogens. My favorite is the one in the center, the little girl saying, if you don't wash your hands after using the toilet, I think it says, you're a disgusting human being, which I believe. That's not cognition, that's about affect. So the question for us is, how do we give people the information but not exclude emotional information at the same time? The key thing is that facts are not usually the antidote to feelings. Anybody who's got a spouse or a partner knows this intuitively. I can't tell you the number of times I have been in public meetings, because I do public health work, where I have heard someone get up from the public health department and say, ma'am, if you would just calm down, if you would just understand the facts, you would understand that everything is just fine. When I hear that incantation that holds so little magic, I look for the exits, honestly, because there's about to be a riot. Telling people to calm down and understand the facts. If you just understood the facts, we could have a rational, a conversation, does not work, okay? So the key mistake often is failing to anticipate, recognize, and address emotional reactions. Again, the tendency, I was taught as a scientist that science is just about facts. We exclude all emotional content because that's not scientific. Well, we got to do a better job at getting the facts across and recognizing people's emotional investment in many of these things. We know in psychology there are a number of factors, for example, scientifically shown since the 1970s and 80s, that there are key contextual factors that matter regardless of the morbidity and mortality associated with a particular hazard. So things like whether you are voluntarily or involuntarily exposed, whether you've got control over exposure or not, whether the exposure is visible or invisible, and so on. And yes, I will share these slides if you would like to have them. Which brings me to one of the most important realizations I had. Again, I've done a lot of work on other issues related other than food, other risk issues other than food. And it took me a little while to go, oh yeah, most of the things I talk about with respect to food are invisible. Bacteria, viruses, parasites, toxins, mycotoxins, and so forth. You can't tell whether they are there as a consumer unless somebody tells you that they're there. And depending on whether I'm in charge or somebody else is in charge, I may or may not believe you because I can't see them. So there are two reactions if I can't see the hazard. I can either ignore it because I'm in charge, or frankly, I don't have anything else to eat, and so I'm going to ignore it. Or I'm not in control here, it's an involuntary risk, and you've imposed this on me, which means that you are evil human beings. So that can increase perception of risk. The other thing, of course, is that most of the benefits of food are also invisible. So, basic macro and micronutrients. taste, texture, before you actually bite into it, you don't necessarily know what it's going to be like. But also things like approved ingredients. Do you really know whether it's halal or not? You know, there will be a label on it, but you have to trust in the person or persons that put the label on it. Production methods, is it really organic or is it not? So we have to have these proxies for both risks and benefits associated with foods that are essentially invisible without those proxies. Again, risk communication, effective risk communication related to food safety often involves persuading people, not simply educating them. And we know from psychology that to change people's behaviors, it's a stage process. People have to be convinced that they are someone that they love or are responsible or something that they value is vulnerable. The consequences of the threat are worth avoiding. People need to know what to do and when, and this is where providing some of the factual information can be important. But honestly, they also have to have the skills, the equipment, and other resources to do it. I have worked with FAO, working with World Food Program. You know, many of the things that we try to help people in countries that don't have a lot of resources understand that they just don't have the equipment to carry out. You know, can you boil the milk, the raw milk? Well, only if you've got a pot, only if you've got fuel. You know, just because we say this is what you need to do doesn't mean you've got the ability to do it. So we need to understand, again, people's starting points. They also have to believe that engaging in these efforts is worth it, that they will be effective and meaningful, and the other people around them are doing these things too. So you create a kind of social norm around these particular beliefs or these particular behaviors. So I'm not the only one. I'm not the weirdo here. Okay? Now, as a psychologist, and you know from your own experience, that changing people's beliefs is extremely difficult for a bunch of reasons. And this goes by various names in various social sciences, but I'm going to use the term motivated reasoning because it assembles a number of these things. The key thing is, once we have decided something, it's extremely difficult to get us to change our minds. Why? Because we are cognitively lazy. We would prefer not to change our minds. It's much more comfortable to continue believing what we already believe. And in fact, we'll look for and readily incorporate information that's consistent with what we already believe or what we've already done, you know, what our actions have already been. And we'll reject new information that's inconsistent with those beliefs. And when we can't reject that information, we will twist that information in ways that makes it consistent with what we already believe. Oh, it's the exception that proves the rule. No, I'm not wrong. This just doesn't apply. And when we try to correct people's information, they will often both reject the information and us. They will resent us for trying to change their minds when they know that they are right. Now, I mentioned that social media has changed. The media environment has changed. I love this cartoon very much. Hear all evil, see all evil, post all evil, right? The key thing is motivated reasoning and social media come together in very evil ways. If you already believe something, with the right search terms, you can find information that will be consistent with what you already believe or what you've already done. And you probably already know this, but you know, what you're seeing in your social media feed is not a random sample of the information that's out there. You are being fed information through algorithms that, you know, look at your demographics, the searches that you've engaged in, your likes, what you've passed on, to feed you specific information. The other thing is that the information we get is often filtered through our friends. So because, you know, so what happens if you strongly disagree with someone consistently, you know, about their opinions over and over and over again? What happens? You marry them. Yes, I know. No, you unfriend them on social media. So they're not our friends anymore. The people we disagree with, we push aside. So only the people we agree with are in our social media feed, and they are our friends because we do agree with them. We do share values with them. And so the information we see that's filtered through them is much more likely to be something that we will agree with. And, you know, none of us are Beyonce. We've typically got a small number of social media contacts or followers, not millions of them. So, I want to leave you with a couple of things. One is we need to move beyond what's called the educational deficit model. Lots of us have written about this. Essentially, much of the communication around food safety and other risks has assumed that if people just understood the science, they would do the right thing, that the facts are persuading on their own. And that the idea is the fundamental problem is we aren't just explaining it right. If we could just do better pictures or choose better language, people would understand what it is we're trying to get across, and then if they understood that, then they would change their minds. The problem is that that doesn't work, and we know that from our own personal lives. Explaining the facts is not persuasion. The psychology of persuasion is very clear. If your intent is to persuade someone, say so. And say why you are trying to persuade. Fundamentally, people want to know in whose interest is it that you are trying to persuade me? Is it in my interest, or is it in your interest that I be persuaded to change my mind or to do something new? So who benefits if they're persuaded, and how? So effective communication begins with people's starting points. So we need to connect not just with what people believe or what they think they know, but also with their shared values. So we need to understand what is it that people really care about. And we need to talk about food safety in ways that connect with what people think they already know and fills in gaps in their mental models that are incorrect. So understanding how people think about these risks, their perceptions of these risks, and connecting with where they are now, not where we hope that they would be, is a more effective way at actually getting people to follow us along a path that we think is useful. Part of the problem, though, and I've done a lot of work for USDA, I've done some work for FDA, I was chair of FDA's Risk Communication Advisory Committee for a while. The work that I have done is pretty clear that people around the world generally overestimate what they think they know about both science and agriculture. People overestimate their basic understanding of scientific principles and how food is grown and produced. If you then ask them objective questions about science and agriculture or food production, it becomes really pretty clear that people just don't know. The trend of increasing urbanization around the world also matters that fewer and fewer people are really connected to the land and to agriculture. So what they learn about agriculture comes through the media, through movies, through social media, and so forth, including a lot of misinformation. The underlying problem is that when people don't know what they don't know, they're unlikely to seek information to fill in gaps in the knowledge they don't know that they've got. And when they encounter misinformation, they don't have enough background knowledge to recognize that what they're hearing is nonsense. So if you don't know what you don't know, that's a problem. So we need to do the empirical work to figure out what people's starting points are and to use market segmentation to deliver targeted messages that connect with what those individual audiences think they know. And I will finish with an emphasis on effective listening, audience segmentation, and message testing before we put the messages out there are really, really critical. You can't just create messages and expect them to work. You can't just make stuff up and expect it to connect with what people already know or believe, already think they know, and fundamentally what they want to know that answers their questions. If you want to be an effective communicator, start with answering people's questions. then they'll hang around for the things you think they need to know. So you can't just create messages and expect them to change people's beliefs, attitudes, intentions, or behaviors. You need to use the science of risk communication, especially related to food safety issues, to be a more effective communicator. So I said I would share my slides. If you would like copies of them, this is where you can find me. So if you would like more information, reach out. I'm part of Rutgers Cooperative Extension. I'm happy to do this. And if you'd like to complain, you can also send me a message as well. So thank you very much. We've got about 10 minutes for questions, and I will take a seat.
Let's show Bill our appreciation. So indeed, we did schedule some extra time here for some questions now that we have Bill somewhat captive in this room. Let's welcome anybody to take advantage. So we'll use the indication system. If you have a question, you could just indicate, and then I'll know who it is.
He's asking good questions, so I know that you were actually paying attention.
So you speak.
Okay.
So maybe it'll be up to me to ask a question or two. Excellent. All right. So I see Australia. If I can figure out how to operate this thing.
Thank you. I think you've done that. I was a little disappointed you didn't bring in risk palate and risk appetite. Sorry, I'm right here.
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you.
Sorry. I was a little disappointed that you didn't sort of put your stuff towards risk palate and risk appetite, making it a food relative thing. But I think that that's partly how I always see it, is that it's the appetite of the individual to actually want to know something or want to change or want to understand. And I think that it's broader than just talking to the community. I think it's actually your intergovernmental discussions and everything that goes on. Have you got any comments around that?
So I agree with you, and there are many, many more things I could have talked about. I was only given roughly a half an hour. I teach a 14-week course on this. If you'd like to enroll, we can talk about risk appetites. I do a three-day course, 8-hour day course for the Joint Institute for Food Safety and Nutrition, which is FDA and the University of Maryland. So yeah, there are a lot of components to this that I didn't get a chance to talk about. One of them is risk appetite, and again, food risks are different, so the kinds of things that we are willing to take on with respect to food risks can be very, very different than our appetite for financial risk or environmental risk or driving risk. So that's absolutely true, which is why we need to drill down specifically on food safety risks, not simply, using the principles of risk communication altogether. Yeah. Another question?
Can I ask the audio-visual people, we have a short survey we'd ask you to complete if they want to put the QR code or the website. Tom, we encourage you to use your phones or your laptops while you're in the meeting. If they could place that up on the screen, but we'll continue with the questions. So I have Japan next.
Thank you for insightful presentation. You mentioned the example of the decline in fish consumption. What do you think the EPA should do to prevent such unexpected consequences?
Thanks for the question. So what could EPA and FDA have done differently? Well, one, they could have done message testing before they put out a press release to figure out how people would react to it. We have marketing experts who help us sell our foods, who do exactly this, who do message testing, who do marketing testing. So, are women ages 20 to 40, what do they think versus women ages 40 to 60? people who live in the American South versus in the Northeast, people who live on the coast, who catch their own fish. These are all different audiences. So they could have tested their messages. And one of the things that you didn't see, because I didn't spend a lot of time on it, is tuna was not actually included in one of the lists of the things that women should not consume. And part of that was because tuna is something that is shelf stable, so canned tuna is one of the things that people who don't have very high incomes can afford. It's a protein that is shelf stable that they can afford, and there was some concern that including tuna might in fact have an unintended consequence. But they never tested the messaging as far as I know. And when I test the messaging, even the modern messaging, there are changes that could be made. How's that for diplomacy? Yeah. Kenya.
Yes, Kenya.
So, thank you so much. I think I want to really appreciate the presentation made by distinguished professor. And my question, or would rather contribution, is in terms of social media. Just the way you have presented is that social media can really present issues that may not even be facts, and the whole population, lot of population, can be misguided. So what is the role of IPA in terms of making sure that social media plays a critical role in passing information that is science-based, factual information, rather than information that really excites the feelings of the public? Thank you.
So the question really is about effective use of social media. And again, we could spend an hour on that or more. So not just listening, but being proactive in our messaging using various social media platforms. One of the interesting things about the various social media platforms out there is that there are different demographics using those social media. So here in the US, I know that people my age are on Facebook. None of my students are on Facebook, and they wouldn't be caught dead on Facebook because their mom is on Facebook. And if they take a picture, holding a beer, mom will see it. And so, the demographics that you can reach using Facebook or Meta or whatever it's called is quite different than TikTok, for example. Most people my age are not on TikTok. So you can do a kind of market segmentation to get specific messages out in specific formats to specific demographics. So it's not just listening, you can also be proactive to get your targeted messages out to targeted audiences. The key is you need people who know how to do that on your staff. And there are people out there, who are training to do that. For example, my son, who consumes a lot of protein shakes, is looking for a job, just saying. So, anything else?
So they posted the QR code at menti.com. Just type in that number. It's about 6 questions. It'll help us for planning future side events and understanding how you plan to use this information. We have one question on Zoom. So if we can have that question come in.
Hello. It's me from Anchor again. And I wanted very interesting presentation, thank you. But you were very dismissive of what you call activists. And I think you don't have, the speaker didn't seem to understand what activists. I do actually count myself as an activist, and have worked for 45 years to try and bring in legislation all over the world, bringing in WHO guidance on warnings and safety hazard warnings and guidance to parents about baby foods. So this is one really important thing. And when we're talking when we're doing all our work, we're not just thinking of one thing. We're thinking of the environment. We're thinking of the One Health approach. We're thinking of all those things that you haven't really touched on. It's not just GM is bad and we'll shout about it. It's for very, very good reasons that a lot of people are concerned about these things. And I would think in Europe in any way, I mean, environment is one huge thing, huge problem that people really are very concerned about, and all over the world, people are becoming increasingly bothered about environment.
So
And
I appreciate the comment. I'm not at all dismissive of activists at all. In fact, I work in the Department of Human Ecology, which is an environmental social science department. We're teaching One Health principles. What I'm arguing is that we should not be dismissive of the approaches that are often taken by activists, which often rely on feelings, on emotion, to get people's attention and to think a bit more about it. I'm suggesting we adopt the strategies of some activists in order to get messages across, not to discount them.
Thank you, Bill. I think we're at time. I called that before I saw the message from the back. It says 5 seconds less. We appreciate your participation. Feel free to reach out to either myself or Bill if you have further questions, and we can put you in touch with Bill and our activities at FAO related to this. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much.